be here with you and share a little bit. There's been a lot that's happened in immigration in the last 12 months since our last teach-in. So I don't know, I've at least felt a little overwhelmed, and I imagine that maybe students preparing for Advocacy Day might be a little overwhelmed. So I was going to frame this a little bit with just some encouragement as far as thinking about where to focus in energy, how to strategically approach the framing of the immigration components, and then go into the 4 priority areas with the teach-in, with the IFTJ, and so that we're all in concordance in that. But I welcome questions as well. So I think I think Kim will take you off mute in the end to ask lots of questions. So just to start out, there we go. I think one observation that I have of students is that in some cases it's really easy to hold on to making lists of different bills. And I think that research into bills is a really important step in preparing for advocacy. But I would really encourage the groups to step back from specific legislation in as far as the focus of the visit. The legislation is an add-on, it isn't your main goal. To be honest, there's just too much legislation to cover, and there's new harmful bills and new sometimes positive bills being introduced every day. So my encouragement when we think about immigration is, instead of focusing on the legislation, really focusing on the personal. So who are the people affected by this? How is that connected locally? So to your particular school, your particular parish, what does new immigration policy mean? And then therefore, why should that senator or representative care? And also thinking about our value add. So there's happens to also be a lot of groups that are doing lobbying trips to DC lately. Because of all of these changes in policy. There's going to be a delegation of Border Dreamers there next week. Our executive director is going to be there next week. There's going to be a Sierra Club lobbying against the wall while we're also in town for the teach-in. So there's plenty of people meeting with offices, but I think what's important to realize is what we as Jesuit institutions can add to that conversation. This isn't just another meeting. This is thinking about framing from Catholic values. When we're welcoming immigrants, we're welcoming Jesus, and how should they contribute to our communities? So this is, I believe, an encouragement every year, but I would say this year even more so. It's important to speak from value-based language and from the personal. And the third suggestion that I have as far as strategy is conveying a sense of urgency to our legislators, whether whatever side of the aisle or they are on. They'll probably don't convey a sense of urgency to people who are incredibly anti-immigrant. They'll convey a sense of don't move forward or act in any way in the near future. But anybody who's in the middle or towards being pro-humane and just immigration policy, there needs to be a sense of things have become much worse, and I'll talk about some of the ways in which they've become significantly worse, and there needs to be a congressional response now. This is relevant in the terms of the DREAM Act. The March 2018 quote-unquote deadline that President Trump gave to end DACA is a false deadline. There's already people who will be, now that renewals are not open, there's already people falling out of status every single day. So we can't wait till March 2018. We certainly can't wait till later next year. We need our congressional representatives to take action now. So those are the 3 points we want to message from a strategy perspective. These are personal stories that relate to us locally. This is important because of our Catholic and Jesuit values, and this is something that we have to do now. So to dive in a little bit to the legislation, I wanted to start with the DREAM Act. I think it's the piece that people have most been talking about is protection for students who have DACA, especially because in so many of our institutions, there's a number of students who have this particular status and are worried about their immediate next step. So I think it's an issue we can speak to with a lot of authority and personal connection. So this, I don't know if that you can see the top. Kim, can you confirm with me whether you can see the top row of this table, or does it get covered?
Yeah, you can see it.
Okay, perfect, because on my screen I can't. So this is a table comparing different legislative proposals related to people who have DACA status. And there's been some conversation about, there's been a lot of reaction amongst senators and representatives in saying, well, we support the kids who are dreamers. But the key question for you to know when you walk into the advocacy visits is that a senator or representative can say that they support dreamers and mean a lot of different things by that. So this is a spectrum of what that could mean, especially in terms of the trade-offs. So you can see the DREAM Act is sort of what we would call a cleaner version, which is this is focused only on giving protections to people with DACA or others who then would become eligible. So people present before 2013, entered before the age of 18, have finished high school or GED. There's a few other requirements, but that is just focused on protection and still has some exclusion categories, but by and large is the best, is the most aligned with our Jesuit values of the bills that are out there. You can see the other legislation on the table has some areas of concerns. So the second act, the Succeed Act, this is something that would benefit individuals who have DACA, but would also prohibit any benefits for their family members. So normally when a person becomes a legal permanent resident, they can apply for their spouse to get legal status. They become a US citizen, they would be able to apply for parents to get status. And this puts a prohibition on that. So it would benefit people with DACA, but it long-term wouldn't help their families. And we care about all members of our community, including their parents. The third act, the exclusions that you can see on that, it invests in border security. And then the second part of this is really important to understand. So the border security, we as Keno Border Initiative, we see the detrimental impacts of increased enforcement, especially the hiring of new agents, and I'll talk to that in a little bit. But it's important to look also at the deportation of gang members. So Senator Flake introduced this particular legislation, the S1937, and he is selling it very much as a bill that's going against the cartels and the gangs. And we at the Keno Border Initiative certainly do not support cartels or gangs and would like them to not exist. At the same time, there's many ex-gang members, so people who are fleeing from Central America, who are coerced into the gangs, who are trying to seek protection into the United States, who would fall under this gang member definition in the bill. So instead of getting the protection that they're now legally entitled to in the US, they would be deported back to their deaths in Central America. So we have to be very careful. There's ways that these bills are messaged that obscures the real detrimental impacts. And I think this is an example. I would also encourage more broadly, and I'll get to this when we talk about asylum, but more broadly, there's been a lot of legislative efforts to try to make, to use the argument of fighting against the gangs to actually have the effect of refusing to accept people who are fleeing violence. So this is, but this, the reason I include this here is because it's an example in the context of DACA. And then the Bridge Act, this was introduced pretty early on in 2017. And it doesn't guarantee any conditional permanent residency. So you can see that it's no legal status, just a continuation of the status quo as far as DACA. So I think it's going to be very important for the groups who are present at the IFTJ to both push for protection for dreamers, but also very specifically name to the congressional offices what we're not willing to trade off on, because we also care about the broader community. We care about people fleeing violence. We care about the parents of people who have DACA status. because that's something that's going to be long-term better for our schools and parishes. So I can answer more questions about that. I don't want to take all my time on the DREAM Act, but I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end. The second component that I wanted to talk about beyond the DREAM Act is deportations and family separation. Now this isn't, on the face of it, this is a very administrative act, the 33% increase in interior apprehensions. According to our data here at the Keno Border Initiative, from January to September 2017 versus January to September of last year, we've seen 143% increase in parents deported away from their US citizen children, and 193% increase in parents deported away from their spouse, and people deported away from their spouses. So we're looking at double or triple the impact on US families, and it's just been absolutely devastating for people who have arrived here. Just last week receiving a victim of domestic violence who was then detained by ICE and deported to Nogales in a matter of days. Or a month before that, we had a dad whose kids were both in middle school from Oregon, and he had been considered not a priority for deportation under the Obama administration. And this year he arrived for his check-in, and ICE informed him that he was now a priority for deportation, and he was removed back to Nogales. So it's something that congressional representatives should have heard about, but I think there's also a lot of perception in Congress that things haven't gotten that much worse. And they need the on-the-ground, this goes to the urgency points, they need the on-the-ground urgency of our groups to say, no, immigration enforcement looks different than it did last year. And you, as congressional representatives, need to take action. This is something that's hurting our Jesuit family, our Jesuit communities. And there's going to be, in the immigration breakout session on whatever day that is, Saturday evening, I think, at the large panel, there's going to be some testimonies of people whose parish were affected and whose whose mom or dad was deported. So carrying those stories forward through Monday, if you don't have your own stories, I'd encourage you to come to the immigration breakout on Saturday night, because there's going to be some powerful examples of how harmful these deportations are. And again, this looks like an administrative matter, but what Congress can do is Congress can refuse to hire more immigration and customs enforcement agents. So that's our big ask. That's one of our big asks on the deportation side, is not approving additional funding for agents, because the more agents that exist, the easier it is to do more deportations and deport more parents away from kids. And then the second ask, and it's more of an aspirational ask, but this is something we're just trying to be consistent on messaging, not that this is going to happen in the next year, to being realistic. In the next year, there's probably not going to be a pathway to citizenship for people who are undocumented. But we as a Jesuit community want to be consistent on that message of saying this is a priority for us, and we're going to stick with this idea, even though it's probably not something Congress will be doing. But here we're really in it for the long haul, and hopefully you'll continue to come back to IFTJ and continue to advocate for this in the years to come until one day we actually accomplish it. So not hiring more ICE agents is the very short-term way that Congress can be involved, and then the longer term is the pathway to citizenship. Because you're trying to move the needle not just on what they decide today, but also influence them as they think over the course of their careers, what are their values? And that's why the sustainability of the teaching is so important. The third point I wanted to raise is asylum seekers and detention. Here again, I remind you that to lead with your values, talk about how Jesus and his family were also asylum seekers. So they also fled from persecution in Israel, King Herod, and fled to Egypt. So we're very much in line with our tradition when we talk about this. If there's a variety of issues, and it depends on your group into how much depth you want to go on these issues. I could have written a whole PowerPoint just about asylum seekers, because it's one of our priorities as KBI, as well as interior enforcement. But your group might want to touch on root causes in Central America. So to say, yes, actually, we don't want people to have to leave their countries and be very specific when you say that. So there's recently, and actually not just recently, and also under the Obama administration, efforts to invest in Central American police and military. I think from the perspective of the teach-in and the origins of the teach-in, we can say pretty definitively that US investment just in police and military is something that's detrimental to the region and detrimental to our Jesuit family, not something that's helpful. So there, when we talk about root causes, we have to be very specific about saying we do want the US to address root causes, but we want them to do that through strong judicial systems, anti-corruption measures, human rights clauses that tie the funding to accomplishing certain protection of human rights. So if that's a topic that your group chooses to dive into, it's going to be more productive if you're more specific on that topic rather than just saying we should do something in Central America, because then each congressperson will interpret that as they see fit. The second piece is the detention in general. So detention continued on the decline. There was an Obama administration guidance on the conditions that needed to exist, minimum conditions for people who are detained in non-ICE facilities. And that's been essentially wiped away. So it's essentially irrelevant at this point as a guidance. You know, people still have the protection of the Constitution, but that's a little harder to access. And ICE is expanding their detention in local jails. So it's not just building standalone facilities like the $457 million Geo Group facility in Houston, but it's in many communities now. There's maybe 10 or 20 people who are being held in those local jails. And that's part of the decline in detention standards, is there's just no way to oversee all of the people in these different spaces. So again, the congressional hook here is very similar to the congressional hook on interior enforcement, which is Congress is the one who decides appropriations. And we need to be very clear with our representatives that we want a decrease in funding for detention, not an increase in funding. This is something that will likely come up at the end of the year with the continuing resolution. It's something you saw last spring with the continuing resolution, so the funding bill, is that they all of a sudden tacked on extra beds, extra detention beds into that measure. And that seems to be the compromise bait that always gets thrown out there. And what that means is that people we've accompanied, you know, we have the woman from Guatemala that I remember very distinctly just sobbing because she couldn't return to her country and sobbing in detention, sobbing in our women's shelter, and then enduring really harsh treatment while she was in detention. Or another man from Honduras who's been in detention for 1 year and 3 months, who we accompanied last summer and remains here in Arizona. These are human lives that are being affected, and we need to, when we talk about detention, even though here I just put stats and beds and all of that, but what we need to policymakers to understand is the people that it impacts, that we're not talking about beds, but we're talking about the people who lay in those beds and who languish and are re-traumatized. So more people used to be released from detention, 2,400 migrants a month, and this year we're looking at about 100 per month. So that again is an illustration of how much of a change there has been, which, as I mentioned, is important for your congresspeople to understand how much worse the situation is this year than last year. I'm not meaning to be discouraging. We also need to be realistic and bring this realism to our congresspeople so that they can take action. So we do have proactive asks on this, which is there are ways to ensure better detention standards and community-based alternatives to detention. So instead of having people sitting in jail cells for months, what we could do is give them a caseworker in their community who helps them connect to a lawyer, who helps them connect to social services. And they're just as likely to show up to their immigration court hearings because they have a community of support, and incidentally, it's a lot cheaper for our community. So as we complain about the harms that we're seeing and ask for less funding for detention, we should also have that proactive ask and better accountability and community-based alternatives. The final piece that I wanted to mention that relates to the talking points and the immigration backgrounder is border accountability. There's been as you could see from the bills related to the DREAM Act and other conversations, there continues to be a lot of talk about how are we going to secure our border, hiring more agents, all of those pieces. When we message this, we should say that what we want at the border is safety and accountability. So instead of saying we should have border security, we want safety at the border, which means safety for the Border Patrol agents, it means safety for the migrants, it means safety for community members, and accountability. So we want Border Patrol to act like a law enforcement force, which they are the largest law enforcement force in the country, and they don't have adequate accountability measures. So as you see there, I put just a couple of examples of that. We find that a third of migrants report suffering some form of abuse. We've only received substantive responses on a quarter of the complaints that we file. And Customs and Border Protection has to double their number of internal investigators or people within the agency who look into allegations of abuse or misconduct in order to even minimally address these rampant patterns of abuse. So our encouragement to our representatives and our senators is, instead of hiring more agents, how about we hire more internal investigators? And that incidentally would make our border more secure because it would protect us from corruption within Border Patrol, but it would also make our communities safer because we'd be less likely to experience abuse, and it would bring Border Patrol up to higher standards. So again, we have the negative of it, and then we want to make a proactive ask in this case, which would be the internal mechanisms for oversight and reform of the complaint system. I have a few other resources, talking points and toolkits you can find on the Ignatian Solidarity website. There's also fact sheets from the American Immigration Council and reports and fact sheets from Detention Watch Network, as well as my biggest sources of news is the America Working Group website. Actually, I'm on their newsletter, and they have an email that goes out every 2 weeks that's a pretty exhaustive compilation of the news about immigration policy in the US and root causes of migration in Central America and Mexico. And then those emails are also on their website, so you can peruse those, but I find them to be an invaluable resource. So that hopefully going through them will help you prep for the teach-in, but I also encourage you to sign up for their email list in general, and maybe in that way continue to stay up to date moving forward. So I want to make sure that there's some time for questions. I'm happy to cover what I talked about or other questions related to immigration. Kim says that I know everything, so I'll probably let you down on that, but I'm happy to at least hear your questions.
Thank you, Joanna. So for folks that have questions, she is the girl to ask, but I am about to unmute you. So if you'd like to stay on mute, I would encourage you to remute yourself. But as of now, you are all unmuted. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Has there ever been an instance where ICE has gone onto a school campus and detained a student who didn't have lawful status?
From what I'm aware of, there hasn't been one in which, in this year, in which ICE has entered the school campus and detained someone. Schools are considered quote unquote sensitive locations, which means that ICE isn't supposed to conduct routine enforcement there. What ICE has been known to do, and they've done this a number of times over the course of the last year or last 9 months, is they sit right across the street from the school. So as people are leaving the school, detain them, which has the same effect of detaining people who are at the school, but it technically respects they're technically not entering school grounds, they're just waiting across the street. But it's pretty terrorizing for their communities.
I'd say.
Yeah, and we've seen fewer kids going to school. There's, I could have included these stats, fewer kids going to school, fewer women reporting domestic violence, fewer people seeking social services that they need just because of this level of fear.
Yes, I have this possible. I hate the shows, like the morning shows. I hate like
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you again, Joanna, for a thorough presentation. I think it is a really helpful tool for folks that are preparing for their meetings. And for folks that are on the call with us, all of these will be posted by tomorrow morning, and I will be sending a delegation email out with a link to the video. So if you'd like to share it with your colleagues or fellow participants, I would encourage you to do so. So thank you again, Joanna, for the immigration webinar. She will be speaking on the panel on Saturday evening of the teach-in, so you can see her again there. And to all of you, I will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.
Pleasure.